All right, everybody, so today I'm going to be teaching y'all how to use a baitcaster, and I'm going to be teaching you some cheat codes for how you can cut down the learning curve for using a baitcaster significantly. As a full-time guide, sometimes I got to figure out how to get people to use a baitcaster if we're throwing something like an Alabama rig where you really kind of have to throw it on a baitcaster. So, a couple tricks for you. In this video, I'm not going to be going into how to properly adjust your spool tension knobs. A lot of guys call them your brakes. Y'all can find another video about that somewhere, some article or something online that'll teach you how to do it. Not going to go into that today. Just going to give you these tips and tricks for cutting down the learning curve on your baitcaster. First of all, the whole idea with a baitcaster is, see that little thumb bar right there? That push button? So when you push that button, it puts the spool into free spool. And it allows your bait to start coming off. So it allows your bait, so when I push it, whoop, see how my bait starts dropping? Okay? So as soon as you push that button, it puts it into free spool. So you have to put you push that button, and you put your thumb immediately on the spool. Okay? And you control the line going out completely with your thumb. Now, one thing that really helps when you're very first learning is to do yourself a favor and put on something relatively heavy. So like a big whopper plopper, like the Whopper Plopper 130, or a big Zara Spook, or like for today's lesson, I've got a big mop jig on here. So nice big heavy mop jig. And so something like that. And because with using something heavy, you can kind of tighten the spool tension down a little bit more than you otherwise would. Once you start figuring things out and kind of get used to throwing the heavier stuff, then you can start coming down lighter and figuring out how to cast that stuff. I'm in the middle of editing this footage and realized I'm missing an extremely important part of the cast in my footage. So here we are in the office. When you go to start your cast, you're going to have one hand on this spool here. You're going to click that button, thumb immediately on the spool, and then your other hand comes down here to the butt of the rod, okay, and it holds it right there. So when you go to cast, that hand that is on that butt of the rod allows you to give a lot more control and a lot more power with your cast, okay? You'll see guys sometimes trying to do a one-handed cast. Some guys have apparently learned to do it that way. I know one or two guys that are actually really good at being able to do it one-handed. But when you're just learning, don't try to do it one-handed. You're going to really handicap yourself. So just put that left hand on that butt of the rod. Be ready to swing. All right, now back out to the lake. Okay, so I'm going to release when my rod is at about a 45-degree angle. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to stop your rod right there. That's just when you release with your thumb. So you're going to release there, but you want to follow through and point where you want your bait to land. Okay, because if you release there, if you focus on that release point right there, a lot of times it's going to send your bait at a downward angle and hit the water and get a backlash. Okay, so I'm going to release there, follow through, and as soon as my bait hits the water, I'm going to put my thumb back on the spool. Okay, because that bait, as it flies out, it starts, you get a bunch of momentum that just starts that spool spinning, and when your bait hits the water, this doesn't know to stop spinning. And so that's when you can potentially get a backlash. So as soon as that bait hits the water, thumb back on the spool, you're good. Now, I encourage people to learn by going casting overhand like this. You can cast sidearm and kind of try to get used to going that way. I tend to find that a lot of people do that. They learn sidearm because it's more forgiving. Because if you let go a little too early or too late, it just goes left or right instead of slamming down at the water. So it's more forgiving on your release time. However, the reason I encourage going overhand is because I found that when guys go to the side, then they kind of pigeonhole themselves so that they can only ever cast to the side. And then they have a really hard time learning to go overhand. Most of the time, you can get a further cast going overhand, but you can get a pretty far cast going sidearm, but you just really limit yourself when you learn sidearm. If you learn to go overhand initially, then it's no problem learning how to cast sidearm. But if you learn sidearm, you're going to really struggle trying to go overhand after you've learned sidearm first. Okay, now I'm going to teach you a couple of cheat codes, okay? These are the things that are going to really drastically cut down on that learning curve. The reason that people give up on learning a baitcaster is to get frustrated with the backlashes, right? So if you can eliminate major backlashes, you're going to be far more inclined to stick with it and get past that learning curve. So here's cheat code number 1. This is the big one. This is the primary one, okay? Now this helps if you've got somebody like me or somebody that can throw a baitcaster in general. It helps if you've got one of them around first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take, when I give these rods to my clients, I make a big long cast initially, pull out a little bit of extra line, okay? If you don't have somebody with you that can make that first cast, all you're going to do is just strip a bunch of line out by hand, okay? And now watch this. Okay, so I've made that long cast. I've pulled a little bit of extra line out, a few feet of extra line. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some electrical tape. I like to use electrical tape because it's got a little stretch to it and it'll form around the spool a little bit better. But I'm going to cut off a piece of electrical tape, usually somewhere around 4 to 5 inches in length, right around there, okay, like so. And then I'm going to take this electrical tape and I'm going to place it on the spool, okay. I'm going to hold it tight and I'm just going to use my thumb and I'm going to start wrapping that electrical tape around the spool, okay? So y'all can see that right there. I've got that electrical tape wrapped completely around the spool. Now I can just reel right over it, okay? See, I can just start reeling over it, okay? So what that's going to do is it's going to make it so that when I go to cast, I'm not going to go and backlash my whole spool of line. I'm just going to get little backlashes that are going to be a lot easier to pick out. And even if you can't pick it out, you know, and you feel like you have to cut some line out, you're not having to cut out your whole spool of line. Okay, so that's cheat code number 1. Here's cheat code number 2. Earlier, I talked about releasing the line when your rod is at about a 45-degree angle. Ideally, that's what you want to do. However, when you are first learning, when you're first making your first several casts, release a little bit higher, okay? What I always tell people to do, so if I've got, if I'm looking at, you know, like a clock here, we got 12 o'clock right here, we got 11 o'clock, we got 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock, okay? I want to release, I tell people to pick a cloud somewhere around, I don't know, 10:30, 11 o'clock, okay? So you're shooting pretty high, okay? And you're gonna pick I'm gonna pick a cloud. I see a spot in the clouds, a gap in the clouds right there. I'm gonna shoot for that. And by doing that, that gives a lot more arc to your bait. So by the time your bait reaches the furthest point, your spool has slowed down. It's not still spinning really fast when that bait hits the water. And so then it tends to be way more forgiving on your thumb hitting the spool when it hits the water. So aim high, pick a cloud up relatively high, you know, up higher than that 45-degree mark, and shoot for that. So it's right around 11 o'clock or so, and that'll allow that bait to come down. Now as you start getting comfortable with that, then you can start bringing it down a little bit, releasing just a little bit later in order to start shooting it out there a little bit further. All right, so there's your couple of cheat codes that are going to really help to cut down on the learning curve with how to use a bait caster. The vast majority of clients that I have try learning to use a bait caster, I can usually get them throwing it at least reasonably well enough to catch some fish on it, and usually by the end of the trip, like, they're pretty darn comfortable with it. So there you go. You can use a bait caster and figure it out typically within a day of fishing or so. Good luck.